Welcome to Romera Records virtual cast. Today we have on Joe. How's it going, man?
I'm well. How about you?
I'm doing well. Yeah.
Thanks for having me on the show, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. So I just found you from Pod Match and basically saw the stuff that you do, and I was interested in having you on. So I guess just kind of get into what you do, who you are, and kind of how you started doing it.
Yeah, sure. So you could find my novels at jvhilliard.com, JV Hilliard, and it's spelled Hilliard. And I write fantasy adventure novels. So if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, or you play Dungeons and Dragons, it's right in that sort of classic fantasy, sword and sorcery kind of genre. Except my books have a little bit of a dark spin to them. It's in what we would call dark fantasy, in the sense that the good guys don't always win. And so when you read the novels, you'll find a little bit of a gothic spin to them. It's a takeoff of what would be what I would describe as classic, like Middle Earth or Westeros, where yes, it's medieval times and things, but it's my own realm, the realm of Warminster. I can't use Middle Earth, I can't use Westeros, for those things. I created my own realm, and with that, I created my own pantheon of gods, my own religions, my own currency, my own, spell system, and the idea behind it was to really kind of uh, kick something off my bucket list. When COVID happened, I didn't have anything to do, and I'm the kind of guy that needs something to do, or else I'm going to drive my wife crazy. And she started wagging her finger at me right away. She's like, "No, no, no, you're not sitting around doing nothing. So go do something." And so I thought I'd write a book, and I was one of that wave of COVID authors that happened back in 2020. But my books became pretty popular, and I've found some level of success with them. I'm now on book four, which will, complete the first series. And that last book, Echoes of Ghostwood, will come out in April of this year. And then I've got a couple of spin-off novels about the origin stories of some of the more popular characters that'll come out the rest of the year. But I've licensed the intellectual property of my books to a video game company that's making it in an augmented reality and a virtual reality game. AR comes out end of this year. VR comes out end of 2025. And I'm also in the process of squaring away a deal that I do the same thing to create graphic novels out of the story of the realm of Warminster. So it's been a whirlwind. I never expected this, and it's taken off, and it's such a divergent thing from my day job that if I told you what I did, you'd be like, "What? How did you end up here?" But this is always my inner nerd that I hid away for many years, and now I just am like, "Yeah, what? Throw the curtain open. This is me. It's me. It's time to go." And I've fallen in love with authorship and really doing the day-to-day stuff for writing.
I actually want to know, like, what was your day job?
I'm a defense lobbyist. I do work with defense companies in DC, working with the Pentagon, White House, and sometimes with legislators. And for the most part, I work on technology projects. So anything that protects the war fighter or helps us win wars, provides for the common defense, promotes the general welfare. Those are the kind of things I'm looking to work on. And so I'll work with large and small, even startup companies that are looking. They've got this next widget that the Department of Defense wants, and it solves a problem for them. I help them find sources of government money, and that could come in the form of grants, or it comes in the form of earmarks, or procurement, which is the government's way of saying contracts. That we're going to buy your widget and put it on our submarines. We're going to buy your widget and put it in our hospitals, or we're going to use your tech and do some research and development with it and create our own stuff. And that's really what I was doing for about 20 years. And that's a rough world, man. It's not for the faint of heart. I don't recommend it to anybody that's not thick-skinned. It's competitive, and everybody's type A, and it was wearing on me. And then COVID happened, and DC shut down for like a year and a half. There was nothing going on. This became DC. It was virtual. It was like, this is the only way you can conduct business. But I had all this extra time because I wasn't on the road. I wasn't staying in a hotel somewhere. I wasn't schmoozing or, working on something on site. So literally had nothing to do, and I've always wanted to do this. I've always had this in the back of my head. But if you ask any of the friends that I work with in my business, "Hey, what book do you write?" I think they would say, "Hey, he writes a historical fiction, or it's a something about history, or something about military history." And it turns out nerd all the way through and through. I am a geek that you would find at a Comic-Con, and no one would know that. And now all of a sudden I've found traction in this realm and I've switched. I just love doing it. And I think my previous iteration allowed me to have the financial independence to do some of the things I wanted to do as an author that many authors or artists for that matter wouldn't be able to do. And COVID, the silver lining in it was it gave me the time that I needed to get it done. And it was a rough process, man. It was not, I'll tell you what, everybody has this theory that writing is just some guy sitting in a corner with a cup of coffee on his computer.
Mm.
It couldn't be farther from the truth. Literally, it's a team sport. It is like it goes from me to my beta readers, and my beta readers tell me what they like and what they don't like. Then it comes back to me, then it goes back to them, and once they like it, then it goes on to my editor, and it goes on to my copy line editor after that to make sure the punctuation's right. Then it comes back to me, and I change all the things that they found that were wrong and plot holes and all that stuff. And then it comes back to me again and back out to my beta readers. And then when everybody says okay, it goes to my publisher. My publisher says, no, no, we're going to change that. And I need an illustrator to make the covers of the books. I need someone to write the blurb because I write 140,000 words and they write 250, and it's just an entire different type of rate. And all of a sudden, by the end, you're thanking 30 people, not including your family and friends who helped get you there. But what I learned was when you're buying a book, you're buying not just that author, you're buying the people that are around that author and made that final product, which I think is pretty cool. And that's why you see all those long acknowledgments in the books, because you feel like you have to acknowledge people for everything they've done to get you where you are.
We might have to have 2 podcasts because you just opened up so many worms just now.
Hey man, whenever you want me back, I'll be back.
All right, so I do wanna get into what you used to do, not so much as far as, like, um, the day-to-day, but, like, so mixing that with what you're doing with the books. Where's your brain? Like day to day, you're doing all this stuff and then you start doing the books. Like, are you mentally engaging in your job, or were you constantly just thinking about all these stories and then like the people you work with kind of turn into characters? Like, where as an author, like where's your brain in the creativity aspect of it?
Yeah, all of the above. So you'll see aspects of the novels that have military history in them. There's a lot of big battle scenes that I've taken from true military history and put my own fantasy spin to them. You'll see characters that you might recognize aspects of from history, both current and far back history. Um, there's a city in my realm called Abacus, which I made off of the Pentagon. And the idea behind Abacus is it's a scholar city. And in many fantasy adventure novels or movies for that matter, it's always the same thing. You see people fighting with swords and shields and riding horses, right? And they never advance. For whatever reason, they have this magic that could destroy the realm, but they can't advance, right? Think about that.
Yeah,
Everywhere you go, Tolkien, thousands of years of history, and the guy's still fighting with a sword,
yeah,
or, Sauron with all this magic and the one ring and he loses, right? Like, so like, yeah, that kind of stuff. What I did was I created Abacus because I wanted to have this realm of invention, sort of like my James Bond Q character that would make this device that gives non-magic using characters a bit of an advantage, or something that a hero could use or a villain gets a hold of that they're now using against the heroes, and they have to counteract that. But the city it's a city of openness, unlike the Pentagon, which is very closed and insular. But they're there chopping away at the next best piece of technology they're going to use to fight wars and protect the country. This is more than that. This is a free city where you can go and anybody's welcome. And so it's basically the Pentagon meets a university, and you can go there and study whatever you want. Knowledge is free to anyone that's there. No one judges you for the stuff that you're studying. And so you find funny things happening on the streets, and things that you wouldn't expect. And it's normal place for people that live there, but anybody visits, it's wondrous because it's new to them. And so you're right. I've taken many aspects of politics and international foreign affairs that I've used to describe the foreign affairs that happen between baronies and different parts of the realm. Religion is a big part of it. I've created my own pantheon of gods, and those gods affect the because they're even though they're not there, they're in a place called the Hall of the Ancients, and my gods are called the Ancients. And they live in the heavens, basically the Hall of the Ancients, sort of like a Valhalla or a Mount Olympus. But every now and then they visit through this divine magic, And some folks can harness that because they're God touched. In other cases, they can harness it by praying to their gods in the same way we all try to do, and affect the outcomes of our lives too. And those things I've been able to take from watching real life drama play out in DC for 20 years. I mean, you see aspects of special interest groups and aspects of religion and people's personal beliefs and people that, are on the far left and the far right. And you find them in this novel hidden and disguised in a fantasy skin, that makes it easier for fantasy readers to swallow. But at the end of the day, there's a similarity because I think the one problem you have in writing fantasy novels is they have to be real. They have to be based in some form of realism close enough that we can suspend disbelief for the rest of the fantasy stuff, right? So I use this example all the time. If I was writing a spy novel, I can say that Joe got in a car and drove down the road. I don't have to tell you what the road was made of. I don't have to tell you what a car is. And I did that in a sentence. But in my realm, I have to tell you if the sky is blue, if there's gravity, what magic's like, what the gods are like. And so it's a world build, and you're building this entire world and you can't leave any aspect out or else there's a gap. And
Mm.
that gap kicks people out. That's jarring. So it has to flow and it has to make sense. And you can explain that as an author, or you can kind of leave it to their interpretation and they can say, oh, that's cool. This is the way I saw that. And you might see it different than me, but it works, right? And so that's what we do as authors. We write that stuff and make that work. So for me, I've used real life experiences that I've lived through and real historical events that the world has lived through and mesh them together into the realm that was the foundation of realism around which I'm building this fantastical realm.
So I will say you are 1,000% right and all that stuff, but us as consumers of that kind of stuff, what keeps us coming back is when y'all leave stuff out. That's that's like we want to know what happens next. And so like have you ever watched Adventure Time, the cartoon?
Yes, of course.
So my wife, me and her both love the show, but I think she's a bigger fan than I am. And she was talking about how like, so we had recently were watching one of the episodes where the Ice King is his former self. I can't think of his name. And
Hmm.
and he's hanging out with Marceline when she's like a little kid, the vampire. And
What a cool character, by the way. It's
yes.
just a really cool. I mean, the aspect of that is really the way that they're taking it too. But I don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
But it's the fact that there's so many different storylines. She's telling me about how like at that point in time in this episode, like the world is just like going to shit and like they don't really know what's happening. And the Ice King is kind of telling you about it, but not really. And he just kind of like leaves that part out. He leaves out the part like really like what's going on. He just says, things are going bad. And then there's also just the fact of like how did he get Marceline? Like where did they come together? And like where's her family? And like all this kind of stuff. But they're just moving along with the story. So it's just so enticing when there are things that are left out because it leaves you wanting more. And there's so many different storylines and especially when you add more characters. The more characters you add, the more storylines you can have.
Oh yeah.
And that kind of stuff has got to be almost mentally exhausting for people like you to think about all the things that you could possibly do.
So I'll answer that in a way that might surprise you. It actually isn't mentally exhausting for me. It's the opposite. Because there's in our realm, there's three types of writers. The first is a planner or a plotter. So when you hear an author called that, and that's me. Like I plot everything before I write. I actually write my stories backward to forward. So I'll write the final scene, then I go to the front and then fill in the middle. And it's like reverse engineered when I write. But I have this big whiteboard in my den, and with like it looks like a Sweet 16 bracket with all these plot arcs and story arcs coming together to the final scene. And when I get done, I erase them, and then I know that they're baked into it. That's a plotter. The second one is someone called a pantser. And the most famous pantser of all time is Stephen King. And Stephen King, he writes by the seat of his pants. And he could just sit down and you could throw 7 words at him and say A, B, C, D, and then he could write a story about that.
Mm.
That would be mentally exhausting for me, where he can't write the other way. He doesn't plan. He just starts to sit down and write, and then the story goes off. And sometimes it has a great ending. Other times, people complain about his endings because he didn't have one when he started writing it. Where I know what my ending was. I already know. I was there first.
Yeah.
So I know where this story is going and I don't screw that up. And then the third one is called a plantser. It's someone who partially plots, someone partially who writes by the seat of their pants. So there's a hybrid in the middle. For me, it would be exhausting if you said, Joe, here's 3 words. Come back to me with a short story tomorrow. Go. I would freeze up. I'd need to know where I'm writing to. But you're right. For me, what is important is that there's no empty real estate in my writing. You will always, if there's something there, if I mention a character or if I mention something by name and I go into a description, it's important. I don't glaze over it if it's it's there for because that's going to come back later in the novels because I've already planned it out and I know where this piece fits. And I need to introduce it in chapter 7, book 1, so that you see it again in chapter 3, book 3. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, connectivity, I get it. Wow, that was really baked into this thing. It was an ingredient we got in the beginning and it's been cooking for 2 books. And now all of a sudden, bam, it's back in my face and in a big way. And that's important for me in the way that I write. So for me, I do the planning up front before I write, and that could take a month or two before, like you outline something, you bounce ideas off of other creatives, you run it by your publisher, make sure that she's okay with the direction that you're going and taking the series, and then once you get all that done, you're comfortable. Then it's like, all right, I know how I can, I can go ahead and do that, and I do that. I'll go ahead and start my writing. But for me, it's not exhausting as much as it's just part of my traditional planning process.
So something that I'm really interested in is just like, so when you're creating characters, and I know you said they have influence from other things, but like the naming, like how do you come up with naming? Even you were talking about currency, places, religion, like all these things. Like, how do you get the naming?
So some of it just comes out of your head. It's a cool name, and you're like, oh, that's a cool name. I got to use that somewhere. And all of us take notes. Like you would be surprised. Here, I've got a little black book that well, you can't see because I have my fake screen on, but like
You know?
little black book that just literally as I'm driving, I'll dictate. If this comes along with me, it's in the car, it's in I take it with my bag everywhere I go. And therefore I've got notes there. Some of them are in my Word. And then I combine them into one document and I use things. So when I'm driving on the road and I see a cool name for a place, or I'm reading a book and I'm like, oh, that's a really cool concept, but let me put a fantasy spin to it.
Mm,
Those are ideas that have come from that. And some of that is just, hey, I went to church and this happened and they said it this way and I thought that was cool. It was something that had gravitas to it. Or, I saw this elected official say something in a way, or they made a move politically and I'm like, oh, that's really cool. Or you read some for sort of militaria, some history, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's really cool how that played in and how that affected the outcome of a battle. I've got to do that in my way, except it's going to be done by magic and not by a grenade or whatever, right? So like you figure that stuff out as you go. And for me, I've always tried to keep those things in order. But the names, I find that there are names that are super acceptable in fantasy, and others that just, if I said, the main character's name was Joe, that jars you right out because there is no Joe in fantasy, right? So I can't use my own name. So I come up with names, and sometimes it's last names turned into first names, sometimes it's biblical names turned into names. Other times it's just stuff I've made up because it fits, right? So like, I honestly I look at it and I say to myself, the naming of stuff, sometimes it could be symbolic. Like there's this strange, cult in my books called the Moor Bog. And I chose their name because a moor is an ugly place and a bog is an ugly place, and Moor Bog sounds pretty cool together. Or they worship cryptids, which are monsters, but cryptid sounds cooler. It has its own kind of twist to it. And there's a cryptozoological community out there that chases, they try to hunt on Sasquatches and Yetis and Loch Ness monsters. And so it's already out there that exists, but I have my own twist to it, right? And so I try to do things with that, and I use real life stuff to find inspiration for names and symbolisms. Like the divine protectorate of Erud is the name of the cathedral that worships the god of knowledge. And but there is no divine protectorate of Erud, and it's like I just made it up. It just sounds cool, right? Yeah. So you sit down and you think about it. It can't be pedestrian, it can't be prosaic. It has to be something that will resonate, that people will remember. And it's like, what? Like divine protectorate of it. That's, oh, there was never one of those. Like, because every fantasy novel has a brotherhood.
Yeah.
right? So it can be the brotherhood of blah blah blah, whatever. Like
Yeah.
I've seen it 100 times. Give me something I'm going to remember. So that's where I come up with that stuff. And it's sometimes I'll stew around and I'll use a placeholder. It might be Brotherhood of Aerud for a while, and all of a sudden now it's the Divine Protectorate of Aerud when inspiration hits you.
Yeah, those things always fascinate me because like as you alluded to, that can make or break your story or your entire book or series, everything. Like the naming of characters and like how captivating that can be because as you were saying, like naming somebody Joe, it's like that's kind of throwing me off. And I was talking
It's
to
true.
somebody I was talking to somebody the other day about just like movies, like the dialogue will literally make or break the movie. Like something could look beautiful, they might use these Netflix approved red cameras and RE cameras and all this stuff, and then the dialogue sucks. And it's like this movie sucks just because the dialogue. So the things that are used in the language. And oh man, that's another thing. Like using a completely different language. People, Americans, we still love anime, even though we might not know Japanese. But if we can read the subtitles, it just for some reason just sounds cooler because it's in somebody else's language.
Yeah. So, all of that you find in our kind of novels, right? And so to go back to what you said, I mean, for me, I don't have my medium is imagination, right? I don't have the ability to show you something in a video game or a picture in a graphic novel or a big screen where the dialogue can sometimes be hidden by the expansiveness of the visual or the audio that you're getting around you. With me, there is no audio, there is no visual. You're reading the book.
Mm,
And so you're creating it in your own mind. And so for me, it has to be explosive. There's got to be things that are going to keep you riveted. So you have to come in every chapter punching someone in the face and walking away at the end of the chapter wanting them to turn a page. And in books, like you said, I mean, you see there are movies out there, like, to be honest with you, the perfect example I was thinking about when you mentioned some movies is Pulp Fiction. Pulp
mm,
Fiction as a movie, it is confusing as shit, but the dialogue is so like I had that conversation about a Royale with cheese. It wasn't with Samuel L. Jackson, but I had that conversation. Like that's a real life conversation. Or Reservoir Dogs, where
yeah.
they're talking about Madonna and stuff, and you're like, what? Like, why are you arguing about this stuff? But that's a real life thing. Like I have among my groups of friends, it's a historic battle that's been going on since we were 21 years old. I was in college, and there were four of us that were living together. And the debate that we started having around 10 o'clock at night that raged on till about 3 in the morning until my neighbor Malik was pounding on the wall for us to shut the fuck up. He's hitting the wall. It was who would win in a fight, Darth Vader or Conan? And I was on the Darth Vader side, right?
I'm
And the Darth Vader side was simple. It's like force choke, my laser sword cuts your metal in half, you're dead. Theirs was, Conan survived death on the Tree of Woe, and he has the power of Crom, and his sword isn't going to be. It was like, come on, guys, it's Conan, and even though Conan might be the ultimate male, right, like the ultimate alpha, it's like I force choke your ass, and then while you're struggling to breathe, I cut you in half, right? And they wouldn't see it. And this went on and they were talking about, they were making stuff up, like literally fabricating, like if Conan's feet are on the ground of Samaria, you can't, that won't work. And I'm like, all right, well, then maybe Darth Vader just flies the Death Star over and blows up the world, right? Maybe he doesn't even have to face him, face to face. And so like even we have inside jokes 20 years later. Like for Christmas this year, I got a plush toy of Darth Vader with a Conan sword that's a letter opener stuck in him, and it was sent to me as my Christmas gift.
uh,
Stuff like that. Or I'll send something that where Darth Vader does something badass, I'll send it out to the same guys, and it's just this raging debate. That is real dialogue, and we could all identify with it. But if it's just like scripted and they're saying the same thing over and over, and in my realm, that happens when you read a book and you use the term said, replied, said, replied,
yeah.
said, replied. You have to break that up, and that's why I'll say a sentence and then I'll say Joe made a cup of coffee, and then go right into the next sentence without saying said or replied. You just have to presume that that's what they said by the next word identifying the character who's doing that action. And that way you don't get said replied all the way through books, because that makes bad dialogue in writing in the same way you're describing bad dialogue in movies. But I'm an anime guy too, so I don't mind the subtitles, and I don't sometimes the music's a little funky and it's a little culturally you're like, where did what, like what's going on, like but it whatever, you just kind of take it for what it is, and you're like, I don't care, I'm just going to go and immerse myself in the world, and all will be well, and we'll figure it out later, but yeah, it's, as long as it's fun, like Demon Slayer, on a surface is like, all right, but you watch it and you're like, this is just fun.
Yeah.
I'm in. I'm down. Let's go. But you look at it from, like, my wife looks at it and she's like, what are you watching? It's like, oh, and you try to tell her about Cyberpunk 2049, and she's like, I just stop.
And so, something you just touched on with the whole Darth Vader and Conan thing, that's so how difficult is it for you to create your worlds, but also make it make sense? Because sometimes, like, like, I'm a huge Dragon Ball fan, and people make fun of Tori, I forgot his name, but the guy who created Dragon Ball, because like a lot of times his stuff doesn't make sense, and
Mhm.
you're like, wait a minute, what, that, like, how did that happen? Because that person should have been stronger than that person, and that move that they did doesn't even, like, some of that stuff doesn't make sense. And then, like, the characters will disappear and come back, or they'll do something, and it's like that person's never been able to do that. Why are they able to do that? How difficult is it for you to have like crowd control and to make sure your stories actually make sense?
Yeah, well, I I've sharpened my writing chops over the years by being a dungeon master in D&D. I played Dungeons and Dragons for 20 years. And as part of that, I started that when I was 10, right? And I've been a character, but most of my life I've been sort of, instead of steady quarterback, I was steady dungeon master. Like, I was always the guy that was telling the story. And so for me, it's the verbal communication of that. And when you're looking around the table, or nowadays when you're looking on a Zoom screen like this and you're playing the game, um, you get a sense when everybody's into it. You feel that. And so some of the stories that I've told are battle tested, and things that characters that have done that have thrown me off as a DM, and you've got to, change course. And part of that is you're telling the story and making sure you're weaving the characters into a tapestry that makes sense for the players and there's no gaps in it. So I've skilled myself accidentally to become an author because I've been a dungeon master forever. And so all I've done is taken that oral presentation and make it now written.
Mm,
And as a result, I think that to me has really helped me get there. And then that eliminates the need for holes. It also allows me to do that crowd control, because as a dungeon master, you're controlling everything. And I don't know if you're a player or have ever played, or at least are aware of it, but ultimately, if you're a player, you're just playing your character.
mhm.
I am playing your character meets 5 or 6 other characters, and then going after the villain. And everywhere you go and everywhere you do, I have to make someone up on the spot. When you go to a town and try to find a rumor at a bar, or when you visit this castle, or you decide to do something that wasn't in my adventure and you go sideways, I've got to catch up. And sometimes there's consequences to that, because you want the characters to kind of follow along the plot line. And sometimes they just go in a different direction, or they make a better story than you made, and you just have to catch up. And so you have to be a good off the cuff storyteller, but also someone who's done well enough to plan for it in the greater sense, so that there's a campaign there. And it's like, I would liken it, if you've never played the game, to playing a video game.
Mm.
Like, in the beginning, your character's a level 1. They don't have great skills. And as you go on and you level up and you gather magic or weapons or whatever you do, you become stronger and stronger and stronger. In D&D, it's the same thing. You're just leveling up one level at a time, until you fight the big bad evil guy at the end. And that big boss is the that's the ultimate end of the story that you put together for this campaign. But it's 10, 12, 15 levels deep. And there's these mini campaigns in the middle that you have to survive these quests. And if you do, you're rewarded for it. Your character gets better and you get more powerful and you can do cooler things. The same thing in the novels, right? You just have to keep that steady. So you don't want to hit them. You want to hit them in the face to get them to pay attention. But also you want them to, like you described before, there's got to be a bit of a cliffhanger so they buy the next book. right? So like book one cliffhanger, you're like, oh, why did he end it there? That son of a bitch. And then meanwhile, you're like, oh, I'm so glad he ended it there because it's a really good ending, right? And so you have to appreciate, and that's part of the craft of doing that. And I wasn't good at that in the beginning. I got coached that. I took a writing classes at a community college. My editors are like, dude, you're screwing this up. Like, take these last two chapters, throw them in the beginning of the next book. This is where book one ends, right? And when
Mhm.
you listen to people that are former bestsellers or edit for that current bestsellers, that's when you're like, yeah, I'm going to listen to whatever you say. Just coach me. Put me in, coach. I'm ready to play, but just tell me what I need to do. I'll run whatever play you call. I'm running it. So just and that's the way it's kind of been. So yeah, I've taken a DM control and given myself up to um, creative license with some of the folks that are around me that are my development editors and beta readers for that matter.
So who are some people that you kind of liken to or aspire to be like, or you just get your inspiration from? You
Oh yeah.
mentioned like J.K. Rowling and stuff like that. There's tons of fantasy stuff coming out, especially nowadays on streaming sites because people love animation. They love to see, like to break away from the the normal things that we have in life. We can see plenty of stuff on the news, but it's nice to see things that are created, that are imaginary, and that people have created from their own brain. So, what's some people that get you draw inspiration from?
Yeah, so it's an eclectic mix, really. I mean, the granddaddy of them all is Tolkien, right? There would not be fantasy adventure novels if it weren't for J.R.R. Tolkien. So it's hard not to have gotten some level of inspiration from him. Also, I think because of my Dungeons and Dragons background, I've learned to appreciate the lit that comes from folks like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman and R.A. Salvatore, because they've been licensed the ability to write stories that are lifted right out of Dungeons and Dragons realms, and I've learned from them. Like Margaret Weiss in particular is really good at crafting characters. Like you fall in love with her characters. And the battle scenes might not be as crisp as a Salvatore battle scene, where where I've taken inspiration from him is really how he, like the minute his main characters are in a battle, you're there right with them. You smell it, you feel it, you hear it. You're right there. And so what I've tried to do is take inspiration from them and do the same thing. And then of course, a lot of these folks were also involved in creation of Dungeons and Dragons games. And so I've taken inspiration from the game generically, like writ large, but ultimately, some of the, more impactful modules that I've played through Dungeons and Dragons are things like Ravenloft, which was an adaptation of Dracula. And it just so happens that Bram Stoker is my favorite author of all time. I mean, there's a guy who literally, I mean, he's famous for Dracula, of course, but at the end of the day, there's so much cool stuff in Dracula that if you start to decode that book, there's a lot of fun things in there that for his time were really good. And like he was creating this gothic horror novel, but it had this real sort of sexy overtone to it. I mean, Dracula takes his women, but he takes them softly and romantically. And you also get the three wives that he has in the drafty castle who are trying to seduce Jonathan Harker. And his writing is, I'm sure, was really racy for the day. But for the book, that's exactly what you feel like the classic vampire is, with the eyes and the handout and the woman giving themselves up to the powerful stranger with the accent and shit like that. Like that's cool stuff. And so I take that gothic spin and I spin it into a fantasy world. And I've seen a little bit of that. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. There's a lot of dark fantasy out there, but my dark fantasy has a specific flavor to it that will remind you of Frankenstein, remind you of Dracula. Of course, they're not in there. I've got my own monsters, but it'll remind you of that kind of thing. It's like it's a mashup of those type of worlds, which I think is pretty cool if you enjoy that kind of writing.
Do you have any characters that resemble? I mean, I know you just said that, but like, do you have any specific characters that are kind of like an elf, or they are
Oh
a?
yeah,
Okay, so you do that stuff. Is
yeah.
that
So
that
yeah,
help?
I think well it does, right? So there's a rubric. Like there are things like fantasy. There are no rules to, right? Sci-fi. There's barely any rules to. In fantasy, you can do whatever you want. So you can make up your characters, but you can't steal someone's character. You can take inspiration from them. And if you read any novel, I mean any novel in my genre, typically there's inspiration that comes from the biggest and the baddest, right? So whether it's the Sword of Shannara series, they had elves, right? Anybody that's in Tolkien, they've got elves, or not Tolkien, Dungeons and Dragons. Anyway, they've got elves. They have different types of elves. So in my books, I've kept some of that because it's familiar to the reader. And I think when you're building a new world, as I may have mentioned earlier, there's some level of familiarity that grounds them in realism that is important. And so if they're familiar with elves, then you want to put a couple of elves, but make them their own. So my elves they're called the Vermilion, and they have red hair and red eyes, hence Vermilion,
Mm.
and like alabaster skin. And they're like the top caste of elves, and there's a structure like a cultural strata, like you find in India with Dale elves that live in the Emerald Dales, and Cascadian elves that live near in the Cascadian forest, and Raven elves that live in Ravenwood, and they all have a different place in their society, which is cool. But they also have different abilities for who they are. But I don't have dwarves, right? I've got creatures called twergs that are kind of like dwarves. They live in the mountains, and they mine and they craft, and they're merchants and things like that. And there are no hobbits, right? I can't use hobbit. That's Tolkien's word. I can't use halfling. That's D&D's word. So I created the Huldra folk, which comes right out of Scandinavian mythology, which is where Tolkien got the hobbits from. But the Huldras were basically this race of, pixies, brownies, like woodland creatures that were there that would create havoc for humans, and they would blame things on them, right? Like a leprechaun. In my world, they are barbarian, like miniature barbarians on steroids that are berserkers that ride war dogs, And so I put my own spin on it, but you can easily see the relation to the greater fantasy realm, which is accepted, but it's brand new. It's gonna punch you in the face because it's something you haven't seen yet. And I've done that with each of my things. I've done it with the Pantheon of Gods. I've done it with the currency. I've done it with the spell system that's out there. I've done it with the characters and their races. I've done it with the realm. There's things that are going to be common that you're going to see that you can bridge and say, well, this city could easily belong in Middle Earth, or it could easily belong in Greyhawk, or it could easily belong in Shannara, or it belongs to Warminster, the realm of Warminster. And so, it just those kind of things I think define you within the greater realm of fantasy, but there's some familiarity to it, so it's easy to get you to buy into it as a reader.
Yeah, I think when people use stuff like that, but put a twist on it, I think that's so awesome. Like when if they might have like evil pixies or something like that, or um a troll that is actually like really helpful. And if you like find the troll and or something, I don't know, just anything that has like a character or a type of character that we're familiar with, but you put like a weird twist on it. I think those are always awesome because it opens up people's imagination that they never thought of before.
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. And that way, when they think, oh, they think elf, and I've got bone elves, and bone elves were bred to do bad things during the daytime when the shadow elves, which were literally shadow creatures,
Mm,
which are the bad elves, and they slink along and they get killed by light. Right. So they don't come out at night. And if you get a torch close to them, they have to retreat. And, light, they fire hurts them because of the kind of creature they are. So it's magical, but it's a different kind of elf, right? But like you said, like bone elves, they show up and they've got this bonish skin with bonish hair, and they're bred to do the bidding of the shadow elves, almost like a slave culture that they've created, and they bow to their sires, their masters, and they go and fight for them because they were bred like the Uruk-hai. And the same thing you find in Tolkien. I mean, Tolkien bred these creatures and goblins to go and fight and do the bad things for the bad people, and that's what the bone elves are for. And one of my more popular characters is a bone elf who you hate. I mean, you love to hate him. You literally love to hate him. He's my Boba Fett, right? And like you're just like, oh, that's such a good villain. And then you find out his backstory, and you're like, oh, like I know how he got there because he wasn't born evil. But in the beginning, he's so bad and
mm,
despotic, and you hate him so much, you're like, I don't even care. And then when you learn his backstory, you're like, I get how he got there. Like the road, it now connects, and it makes it more real, and then therefore it's more believable because now it's like, where did this guy come from? Why is he so bad?
mm.
Why does he do this stuff, and why does he have no emotion? And then you're like, oh, I get it. There's a trail of vengeance here, and I see what happened to him, and now I know why he's doing what he's doing, and it becomes believable. Same thing with the ultimate villain, the big bad evil guy in my novels is Great Taurus the Mad. He's a tortured soul because he was cursed by his own god, but
Mm.
it was because he used his divine knowledge to see the future, and which was a big bad no-no. It was like a number one commandment is thou shalt not use my power to enrich yourself. And he did that. And then when you find out later in the books why he did it, you're like, oh, I get it. And then you see if is there a Darth Vader path of redemption where he comes back to being Anakin, or he just go off the rails and Greg Taurus can't be redeemed, right? And I think that kind of stuff, even though it's a little tropish, I think people that read our stuff love that stuff and they want to see that hero's journey, and if there's bad stuff in there, okay, we'll live through it.
Something that I have always noticed that I can't stand is when people make the villains look so awesome and
Yeah,
and sound so awesome. I'm like, oh my god, I wish the good guys were like this, but sometimes the villains end up being like the coolest looking characters, and they have just like the best powers. It's like, oh, well, I guess the reasoning why people do that is because if the good guys were just more powerful than the bad guys, then story would be over, I guess.
yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. One is that it goes back to the comic book story where the good guys have the square jaws and the good looks and are demure and all the ideological things you want in your heroes, right? So whether your heroes are Superman or Black Panther or Flash or whatever, you see them and you want them to be the best of what we are, right? And that's what that is. The villains are the ones that it's okay for them to look badass because they're going to be extremely on the opposite side. They are the antithesis of what we believe. So they have narrower features or features that would repel us, and repulse us because we want them to be bad and we want to defeat them because in the end, thematically, they are the worst part of us and we want to stop them at all costs. But in order to make them that, it's sometimes hard to overcome those bad things. We all know that. So from a symbolic perspective, you want to make them hard to overcome. So whether it's me overcoming a physical condition or an economic situation or a mental problem, we all fight those struggles. These are epic struggles fought by epic people. So you want to make them almost godlike and make it really hard so that when the heroes sacrifice and get to the end and win, they've won against the big bad evil guy. They're called the big boss for a reason in video games because they're supposed to be big bosses. They're supposed to be badasses, right? And we overcame that. And whether it's a simple thing where it's like, you know what, I got a job and now my life's a little bit better, or I finished school, or I got my kid into the right school, whatever that struggle that you did, you're identifying, even though you might not know it, you're identifying with this struggle against Sauron or Darth Vader or somebody like that, right? And in that way, these guys have to look. I mean, let's face it. I mean, Sauron's a badass. Darth Vader's looking, he's a badass, right? You
That
want those guys looking, so it's easy for you to come back to it. And so, like, Great Taurus is this weak, skinny, frail guy whose eyes have been stolen by his god, and his eye sockets bleed eternally. And he's in pain as he's dying because of the curse. And the only way he can relieve the curse is to do something really bad. And you're cheering that he never gets there. But because of that, he looks the part, right? You find him in a bank of fog coming in the main character's dreams, who is a prophet and sees him coming to take revenge for this curse and is afraid of this guy. You need to be afraid of him. So you smell his rotting flesh when Damis gets close to him. You see the crimson rivulets that drip from his eyes because that would scare the crap out of me. So I wanted to scare the shit out of Damis, right? And anybody reading, I want them to be in that nightmare with me. And so it's important for them to be extreme, I think. And sometimes being extreme makes you pretty cool, pretty badass, right?
absolutely. So another thing that I always think about when I see imaginary characters is like the OP character, the one that's like Dr. Fate, how he
Hmm.
kind of isn't really doesn't get a lot of action because it's almost like, he could just kind of do whatever he wants. And Thanos, when he has all the stones, it's just like
Yeah, right.
so powerful that it almost doesn't make sense for them to interact with all the other characters. How, I guess, taboo do you feel like that using characters like that where they're just way too powerful for the rest of the characters to even give them a lot of airtime or playtime within the story.
Yeah, so I'm not opposed to it if it's used parsimoniously. Like you can't use it all the time, and they just can't come in and swipe. Um, like Elric. If you read the Michael Moorcock novels, I mean, he has a Stormbringer, which is a sword that if it touches you, you die. Right, like that kind of stuff. Those kind of things um, are ultimately power. They're godlike in that sense, and there could be some of that fear. Like I like embedding that fear to some degree in all of my novels. You want something that's mysterious and powerful, and why is this happening? And it's just unattainable for those characters in the beginning, but as they grow, they find ways to defeat it and overcome it, and they find those things. So even in the smallest level, if you're reading, you mentioned Rowling's before, the Horcruxes and Harry Potter and the stuff there. He's a kid, right? He's basically a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 13, a 15-year-old, and he's fighting the people are dying around him, right? And like it's one of those things where as a child, some of that stuff would scare the crap out of me. And you show me a guy that has a face with no nose, and this spindly arm with this wand that looks, that's scary to a 12-year-old, right? It's just something you're like, wow, you're gonna have nightmares about that. But I'm writing for primarily an adult audience or an advanced young adult audience, and it has to be scary. So the way that you describe it, I think, really helps. I think that those things that are unattainable, you have to show if you're going to use them, you have to show a path as an author of a way of countermanding them, right? And so using your Marvel example with Thanos, it was all the goodly characters in the world came together to stop Thanos, and that's how we're going to do it, right? And so it's everybody coming together. We have to do it as one big team, arm in arm. Doesn't matter where you're from, we're going, because this is in everybody's best interest. And I think you see that in Star Trek too, with Q, or these godlike creatures that are dabbling with humans to see if they're advancing and stuff like that. And you see that stuff where there's got to be a path out, like a trick or something that they have to discover, or a quest that they have to complete that will allow them to countermand that godlike ability, so that there is a path to victory. And if you show them that, then it's like, all right, how are you going to get there? Now it's, as a reader, I'm interested to know how you're going to take me there, and how are we beating Thanos today? Because I don't know how to do it. Well, here it is. We've got to go to this world and get this and trick him, and his daughter's going to distract them while I'm coming up from behind, and blah 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 blah. Yeah, and I think if you show that path, you'll be okay.
Yeah, those are always interesting because, that's what you want to do when you play a video game, or, you think about imaginary stuff. It's like, how powerful can somebody be? How strong
Hmm.
can this character be? And you were just talking about the fear thing. Like when we watch Harry Potter, we they have this mystique about Voldemort where it's like, oh my God, he's too powerful. Like, how are we ever going to stop him? But it gets developed, as you were talking about, like over time, the evolution of the good guys. It's like, hey, we're not there yet, but somebody's going to teach us some special technique or something in the future to where it's going to work out. Like, they don't worry, like, we're going to learn something, we're going to find a new character, and that person's going to help us. Like, something's going to happen to where that evil person within the story, we can defeat them. And
That's right.
that development in the story is what keeps everybody, on edge waiting to see more.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's the kind of stuff that keeps you coming back, right? You want to find out. And it's okay. Like Thanos was an evil guy before he had all 5 stones, right? He didn't have the gauntlet, the infinity. So they just weren't, but he was searching them. We have to stop him. And that was, let's put an end to this, and then he succeeds and wins. And as you're like, this can't be the end. It really can't be the end, right? What's next? I'm gonna go see the next one. How do they really beat them? How do they get everybody back? And then you're bought into that. So there are stages of that too, and there are tricks of that. So like there are this is going to sound dumb, but there are plot lines that you'll have for certain stories. So like there's a W plot line which starts out and it looks like a W. So I'm going to do this opposite because I'm on a screen, but um, the tip of the W, the first part of the W is the character starting on a level ground. And
Mm.
then something bad happens to them, right? And they're down here, and then they partially recover and then the villain or whatever the bad thing is happens again, and they fall again, and then by the end of the story they come back to level, and
Mm.
it looks like a W. That's that's a real script where you're writing toward that, but people don't even know that. But if you put that up against any book or any movie, you'll see that pattern over and over again because we don't know it's happening, but it's happening. And
Yeah.
people buy that stuff, read that stuff, listen to that stuff, and go to that stuff in the theaters. Then there's like the hero's journey where you've got familiarity. And if you looked at like the Iliad and the Odyssey written by Homer thousands of years ago, it's basically Star Wars. It's basically Harry Potter, right? Like, so you have an unsuspecting hero, in our case, Luke Skywalker or Harry Potter. And, Luke lives with his uncle and aunt in a faraway land and doesn't know his real powers. But then Ben Kenobi comes and rescues Luke and says, "You have all this power and I'm going to train you." Well, Harry Potter lived under the stairs with his uncle and aunt in London, in a faraway land from Hogwarts, and Hagrid comes and says, "You're Harry Potter. I'm going to take you to that realm, and we're going to train you." And so, where Luke became a Jedi, Harry became a wizard, and he went through Hogwarts. He went through Jedi training, and then, of course, there are the helpful rogues that pop in and out and help to advance the story. And you're going against this evil, whether it's Darth Vader slash Emperor or Voldemort. And it's the same storyline called the hero's journey that takes you from the beginning to the end, and it's the hero's maturation and the struggles that they overcome, and you don't even know what's happening, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, these things are the exact same story told with different characters, but it's that plot line that people like. And there's a lot more. I'm just giving two because that would be boring if I'm sitting on the other side of this listening to it. So I'll stop where I am, but just to show you that that's how those things are planned, and so that's why the Thanos stuff keeps us coming back to the theaters.
Absolutely. Like knowing that there's going to be some kind of um evolution that we're going to witness and some kind of development from the characters. That's what keeps us wanting more because we're like, are they going to be strong enough or
Yeah.
is somebody else going to come into play? Like, how is this going to happen? Like, this doesn't make any sense. This person is not strong enough, especially in like Demon Slayer. I think they did a phenomenal job of
Yeah.
confusing the piss out of me because
It's
there's
true.
no way this guy is going to be able to defeat the rest of these people. And then
Yep.
all of a sudden, like one of the other characters will come in and then they'll help out, or like he'll go through some situation where it ends up working out. And sometimes it like his body's just so broken down after a fight. It's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. It's not like he came out of it and was like, yeah, I'm good. It's like, no, his body's literally destroyed right now. He needs time to rest.
Yeah, I think that the uh the what demons well, I won't go down a demon slayer path, but you're right. I mean, you see that all the time. It's like but that's okay. That's what you cheer for. Those they're underdogs, and we all cheer for the underdog. We all cheer for the redemption story. We all cheer for the struggle because we all have gone through it. And I think, again, as readers, watchers, viewers, or listeners, we all like that kind of stuff because we want to cheer for that guy. We don't always want, it's like, Tom Brady's going to win the Super Bowl again. Oh, God, not again. You're like, come on, like somebody else. Can someone beat the guy? And there's part of you that, like, it's like, you know what? He's the best of the best. He's the GOAT. We'll live with the fact that he's the GOAT. No one's going to be better than him. And then, oh, Patrick Mahomes looks pretty good. And it's like, well, maybe. And then you go into these comparisons. It's just I think it's a human nature. It's part of the human condition where we're always looking for that, you know, ultimate, in this case, we're always making our bad guys the ultimate because you want to defeat them, you want to overcome them. And so while you cheered for Tom Brady as the underdog when he was like, holy cow, Tom Brady, and now he's Darth Vader, and you're like, anybody beat him? Just can somebody step into the ring and beat the guy?
Yeah. What's that? Dang, there's some quote from like a movie or something where he's talking about oh, it was Bane. Bane said that about you live long enough to be the villain or something like that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So like your heroes become your villains. Yeah, and it's just, and yeah. By the way, great villain. By the
Oh yeah,
way,
Bane.
yeah, that's badass villain. You know what I mean? He reminded me of Humongous from like Mad Max.
Mm,
With like the mask on, he was yelling into the microphone, like screaming at Mel Gibson. All but with a Batman darkness to it, right? It was like cool. It wasn't post-apocalyptic. But it just reminded me of that so much. It was cool.
yeah, I think the movie Bane Not like them. Oh, dang, they should make a movie about Bane. But
Yeah.
in the Dark Knight, him as a character was way cooler than the cartoons. Like the
No,
cartoons
no doubt.
was it was too cartoony, like with the tubes and everything, but like the realism of like a real Bane, that was pretty cool. And then also I think the realism of, did you see the Joker movie that came out
I
recently?
love the Joker movie. Yes.
That was fantastic because it made us think about what if the Joker was a real person who just had
Hmm.
psychological issues. And I was
Hmm.
like, oh man, that's a good thought.
Yeah. And DC can get away with that because they've owned Dark. Where Marvel owns heroes, they own Dark.
Mm.
And Dark Knight, I mean, when they did Batman back in the day, like I'm talking about 90s Dark Knight comic books where Robin is killed and the new Robin is killed and Batman is older and crippled and all this other kind of stuff. But you just see, that it just that kind of stuff, there's a realism in there. And when they did the Joker, that was my favorite Joker. Nothing against Jack Nicholson, nothing against Heath Ledger, nothing against any of the Jokers that are going to come and go, but man, oh man, that felt visceral. Like I was that could happen, right? Like that's like where it's like, all right, this guy's just not some whack job and has makeup on. This is a guy that you saw him get there. He was a clown. He was looked down upon. He had met him, and the way that the society there just pushed him down, it created that, and his own mental condition. And you're like, woo, that's they did. I thought they did a fantastic job. And Joaquin Phoenix kicked butt. I mean, that guy was. I mean, he was the Joker. There was no other. I didn't see Joaquin Phoenix in him anymore. I just saw he was a vessel for the character, and that was badass.
Yeah, anytime you take something that's imaginary and make it believable, like, what I was talking about earlier is making sure that your story makes sense. That's
Hmm.
what captivates people. And even like, did you see The Last of Us, the TV show?
I know what it is, but I only saw a weird thing about it is I saw middle episodes. I didn't see the beginning and didn't see the end, but I liked it. I thought it was good.
So I think it's like the very first episode is like a talk show, and people were posting it online because they were trying to make it like, it was a real talk show.
Oh
But
yeah, like War of the Worlds kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah. And so basically they had it set up like a whole talk show, and it was some guy talking about how um fungi could infect people and live from humans as like a parasitic type of relationship, and that would turn us crazy and make us, into the things that are in The Last of Us. And so they made it realistic. They were like, okay, and he was like giving scientific facts to make it show how fungi could literally take over the world and be parasitic. And I was like, man, they set this
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, and then you're just like, oh, really? You start thinking about that late at night,
Yeah,
and you're just killing every mushroom you can get.
absolutely. Yeah, it's actually about that time for us to wrap up.
Gotcha.
So go ahead and give everybody again like names of your books and then a
Sure.
website, all that stuff.
Yes, I am really easy to find. JV Hilliard, HILLIARD.com. My books are available pretty ubiquitously. So if you're an Amazon reader, you can download them from Amazon or iTunes. If you like ebooks, if you like audiobooks, you can find them on Audible or all the platforms that offer audiobook services. You can go to my publisher, dragonmoonpress.com, and download them there. You can buy them from my website. Socials are easy at JV Hilliard Books. You'll find me on TikTok, Amazon, or excuse me, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Discord. I'm just JV Hilliard on Facebook and on I know I'm missing one in there, but if you look for JV Hilliard, I'm that guy. You'll find me wherever you look.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about everything that you do with your books. And I actually really want to look into this and read some of that stuff because it's awesome finding out about people's imagination. Like I really love that kind of stuff. So again, thank you for sharing everything.
Been my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. Well, alrighty. Thank you for everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.